World at War is the last and most realistic take on war in the Call of Duty franchise. And what I mean by that is that it captures the feeling of war. I know World at War is not completely historically accurate, but it still captures the feeling of being inside combat, and especially the feeling of World War II. But after World at War was released, no other Call of Duty campaign tried to capture the same gritty, realistic feel of it. As later on, the COD campaigns became more action-packed, almost like a Hollywood movie, and especially when they went back to World War II, with Call of Duty World War II. That did have some extent of the grittiness, but not to the extent of World at War, as Call of the World War II campaign just felt like a generic Hollywood movie about World War II. And especially for that COD, as it mostly focused on the Western Front when Americans landed on D-Day, which this depiction has been done a lot of times. While World at War focuses on, well, I like to say in my opinion, some of the forgotten fronts of World War II, with the Pacific Theater and the Eastern Front. With that will be kind of a secondary title / topic for this video, as it really captures the feeling of fighting in these two fronts, especially with the Soviets with the Eastern Front. But back to the feeling of war, as World at War is that feeling when you start out the game with the main menu. The song that plays in the main menu was always haunting, and especially for me as a kid, it always made me uneasy. As for the lyrics, they're in German, and when you translate it to English, they say "Brave soldier, die with me," and it goes on with the choir repeating it. With this song, we're already put into the feels of the game, and it's due to this haunting song, and it already sets in the tone for the rest of the game. I feel like a lot of games don't have the same feeling as this one when it comes to main menu songs. For me, the games that come to my head are Halo and Battlefield 1. Oh, there's other ones, but these are the only two that come to my mind, as they help set in the tone for the rest of the game. But back to World at War, because when you start a campaign, it gives a summary intro of the early stages of the war, as the Germans have a whole control of mainland Europe and the Japanese Empire early campaigns in Asia, and especially in China, as Japan captured a majority of land from Nationalist China and the People's Republic of China, and shows real-life footage of some of the war crimes of Japan did during the war, as it shows actual live footage of someone getting executed, and another actual footage of people being pushed into a mass grave, burying them alive. In American media, there's hardly any depictions of what the Japanese did during World War II. They hardly show of any of the war crimes they did. As for World at War, it doesn't fully show the full extent of the war crimes the Japanese did, but at least it gives us some brief overview of what they actually did. And most of the war crimes were mostly targeted against civilians and POWs, prisoners of war. And in the first US mission, we get to see what happens to them. Back to the summary intro, because it shows an important event for all us Americans. As America was against the Japanese conquest in China and Asia, and embargoed Japan of all oil supply. Did this as a protest to the recent conquest of Japan, further pushing into Asia, as they conquered Indonesia from the Dutch, and the rest of the French Asia colonies. For this, the US was exporting oil to Japan, but enough was enough, though America embargoed Japan, and as a result of that, on December 2nd, 1941, Pearl Harbor was attacked. It would be one of the times an attack has happened on American soil, which brought America out of isolation and awoken the sleeping giant. America was now officially in World War II. With this summary, we already set in from America's perspective in the war. Pearl Harbor attack only inspired many Americans to fight. Before, many Americans didn't care about the war in Europe or Asia, as it didn't bother us. It was across two oceans and it didn't affect us. But with Pearl Harbor being under attack, we were thrust into the war. Only cause of patriotic fervor inside America. Our way of life was in danger, our freedom was attacked, so America was going to be ready for war. All these cutscenes share the same style of way of displaying information. To me, it always made me feel like an interactive documentary. Never watching these cutscenes, and they do it very well with both of the campaigns, especially with the Soviet campaign. But first, I'm going to start with the American campaign, as it captures the feeling of the Pacific Front really well. First mission, we already see fully of what the Japanese did to the prisoners of war, especially for the Americans. But still, a quick footnote, American prisoners were treated slightly better than Chinese prisoners, but it's not saying much as being captured by the Japanese was a guaranteed death sentence, no matter what. The reason the Japanese were so brutal it was because their warrior code, which was called Bushido, in which a warrior had to go down in a fight no matter what, as being captured was a dishonor. They expected other nations to have the same way of fighting. That's why they treated civilians and POWs harshly. They expected them to keep fighting no matter what. And it didn't matter what location it was too, because in the Black Cats mission, towards the end you see PT boats shooting some of the crew members of the recently sunken ships. But back to this cutscene, because even the Japanese officer mocks you because you're being silent as he sees it as a false sense of strength. And while you look on, you see your squad mates get beaten. And they have been beaten for a while, as you can see blood on their faces, on their body, and on the floor. And you watch your squad mate, Private Pile, that's next to you, get burned and killed right in front of you. And you're expected to be next, but Roebuck saves you. The cutscenes and the gameplay shows how the Japanese army is ruthless, but later on we'll see more of their brutality. And also, not many would know this or care about this, but the Japanese officer is the only one to speak English throughout the whole game. But he only does it for a brief moment as he goes back to his native language. And throughout the whole game, the Japanese are only speaking their own native language. Also too, I like how they don't show subtitles, we're left in the air of what they're saying. And due to that, we're already immersed as a US soldier in the Pacific, as most soldiers that were sent to the islands, Japan had under control, had no clue of what they were saying. And they only know about the basic parts of it, but most of the time they had no clue of what they were saying to them. So the way how the Japanese soldiers treat your squad mates, and also their foreign language, we already have one of the feelings of war. The enemies being dehumanized in front of our eyes. It's like the perspective of any soldier. We're in the dark, we're fighting a foreign soldier, and we have no clue what they're saying. We are only seeing their harmful actions, and they intend to kill you no matter what. So of course, you naturally react by fighting back against them. And also too, you want revenge for what they did to you and your squad mates. And even the team that rescues you share the same sentiment. They're gonna make the Japanese pay. For both campaigns, they share a sentiment of 3 emotions: revenge, vengeance, and avenging. And it's especially more prevalent in the Soviet campaign. But there's still some of that emotion in the American campaign. And we'll get onto the Soviet campaign later on in the video. But for the rest of the American campaign, on the Pacific Front, it was an island hopping strategy. And it was a brutal campaign. The Japanese fought tooth and nail for these islands. And these islands are really small. Especially for the couple of missions on the island Pelulu. To get the sense of scale of how big Pelulu is, the size of Pelulu is slightly larger than one of the smallest nations in the world, San Marino. The Japanese soldiers are willing to die for this small stretch of land. And on these islands, they were really entrenched really well, had really good defensive positions. Even the cutscene states it too, as it says they're dug in.
He's dug in deep, and we have to get our hands dirty. Flamethrowers. We'll burn them out.
To counter this, they use flamethrowers, flush them out of their own positions. And not even that, the Japanese use the terrain for their own advantage, as we see they set up booby traps, use the trees as sniping positions, and the constant bonsai charges from the foliage. We're always on the edge no matter what. And when we get moments of calm, we're put back into the fight immediately. We're always on our toes. And back to the calm thing, because when it happens for a little bit, something bad always happens no matter what. Go Sergeant Sullivan dying, and some of the US troops getting caught in the trap. And even towards the end of the US campaign, when they do a fake surrender and blow themselves up. They're killing Private Polanski or Sergeant Roebuck. And when the missions have finished with the Battle of Pelulu and the Battle of Okinawa, it doesn't feel a sense of victory. Especially with the Battle of Pelulu. It takes for a couple missions of the island to be fully captured. Too many Marines died, and it was over a small piece of land. Even for the last mission, which takes place on Okinawa, which the mission is called Breaking Point. Fighting was just too much, and every Marine is tired. This was just Okinawa. Okinawa was the bloodiest battle in the Pacific theater. And just imagine how mainland Japan would be. If the Japanese were willing to die for these small pieces of islands, I know Okinawa is kind of a big island, but the other small pieces of islands, then how was mainland Japan gonna fare? After the Battle of Okinawa was finished, it helped influence the decision to drop the atomic bomb. But also too, the way how the American campaign feels is that it's a slow build into it, getting exhausted by each mission. And it's becoming stressful for the troopers, even the older ones. But they're not even old, they're not even out of their 20s, as this line is quoted by Roebuck. And with this quote, it shows how stressful it has been. As taking the island slowly by slowly was wearing down the troops. The Battle of Okinawa was the last straw. Too many Americans died. As now it was going to get worse, as the next plan was to invade mainland Japan. But like I said earlier, the Battle of Okinawa helped influence the atomic bomb. The whole American campaign captures the feeling of the Pacific theater. It was brutal, it was long, and it was ultimately demoralizing for the troops that fought in it, which War to War perfectly captures it. Before I get done with the American section, I would like to add that what helps elevate the war factor in this game is also the sound design, as they actually use guns, and recorded voice lines of the characters talking over the gunfire. Many games don't typically do this, but this just makes it more realistic, and even the cutscenes elevate it more. Like I said earlier, it feels more of an interactive documentary, as it shows a mixture of real life footage and also too with the game's graphics, or motion graphics, I don't know what you call this, but it helps elevate it more. And so that's the end with the American campaign. As for the Soviet campaign, it is drastically different. And what I mean by that is the feeling of it. Emotions fought on the battlefield on the Soviet campaign is different from the American ones. As for the American campaign, the last mission, there was no sense of victory. It wasn't worth it. So many Marines died for this to happen. And as for the Soviets, you get a differently drastic feel with the first mission, Vendetta. The way how the Soviet campaigns open up has to be one of the most iconic cutscenes in Call of Duty, as the first mission takes place in the bloodiest battle in history, the Battle of Stalingrad. And where we start off is one of the most famous places of Stalingrad, the Bar Meli Fountain, as we're in the same fountain with the rest of our dead comrades as we hide with them, and the German soldiers finish off the rest, but don't kill us as they think we are dead. But there is another soldier with us, Reznov. He was one of the most important characters in the Soviet section, and I will show you why that is the case later on in the video. But as for the environment of the first mission, it captures the war-torn city of Stalingrad. It's almost devoid of life. You hear crackles of gunfire in the background, and the German bombers fill the sky. This was once a lively city, but now is a war zone. The Battle of Stalingrad had many casualties for the Soviets. Around 1 million to 2 million died. As for the Germans, it was around 800,000 to 1.5 million. In American media, or you can say Western media, not much is shown on the Soviet front, despite them doing most of the work. But I think this has to do because of the Cold War. But for today, I think it should be shown more. But I think that will be hard now because considering that incident that happened 2 years ago. But a lot of Soviets sacrificed themselves. But anyways, back to the mission. For this mission, it captures it really well. As for the Battle of Stalingrad, it was the turning point for the Soviets. As for the beginning parts of the war, Germany captured huge swaths of land during Operation Barbarossa, and were basically at the gates of Moscow and surrounded Leningrad, two important cities for the Soviet Union. And during the early stages of the war, the Soviet casualties were already in the million. As for the Germans, it was only 100,000. Now you can attribute some of these casualties to Stalin's policies during the early parts of the war, as the war was a massive surprise to him and he wasn't really equipped for it. But the Germans were ruthless. As for the Soviets, they didn't see the Germans as a regular invading army. They saw them as a genocidal army. The Germans weren't intent to conquer them. They were there to exterminate them. So they showed no mercy to the people of the Soviet Union. All these actions from the Germans caused a massive patriotic fervor across the country. And with the patriotic fervor, I like to compare it to us Americans. Whenever a foreign power has attacked us, it always united us Americans, no matter what. And I would like to say it was the same thing for the Soviets. As for their version of this, it was a war out of survival. Important war for them. Many people might not know this, but the Soviets called World War II the Great Patriotic War, the Sacred War, the People's War. They had so many titles for this, it shows how much importance this was to them. And even made the victory over the Germans a holiday, Victory Day. After the victory of Stalingrad, this caused a wave of vengeance for the Soviet people, and Reznov perfectly represents this vengeance.
This place once echoed with conversations of friends and lovers. No longer. Mark my words, comrade. One day things will change. We will take the fight to their land, to their people, to their blood.
In my opinion, his speech represents what the Soviet people felt. They wanted justice for what the Germans did to them. And the music for the Soviet section elevates it more, especially in Reznov's speech. And throughout the game, Reznov encourages every soldier to do exactly what he does, exact vengeance against the German soldiers. And as we play along, we're getting the same feeling as Reznov and the rest of the Red Army. And after Vendetta is done, in the next mission, the Red Army gets their revenge with the Battle of Silo Heights, and the level of their land, their blood, which echoes Reznov's words, and the rest of the Red Army feel the same way as him, except for some of them, like Private Chernov, as he feels it's wrong for killing the Germans when they're already surrendering, and already beaten. he sees it as an unjust thing. He sees the rest of the Red Army and Reznov wholly captured by vengeance. But for you, it's different, as you're given a choice. In the first mission, you could given a choice of finishing on the Germans in the beginning. My playthrough, I let them go. But throughout the missions, you get similar decisions like this. I don't think any war game or any other COD game has done this before, but I may be wrong on it. But these decisions are based on morality. It is up to you if you want to follow with the Red Army and Reznov's revenge. But throughout the whole game, it's like a shared vengeance. It's like actual history, as if you were German captured by the Soviets, you were most likely not to survive. And it was so bad during the late stages of the war, some German armies would purposely surrender to the Western forces as they did not want to be captured by the Soviet army. And the game shows that, as we get to see what happens to the captured German soldiers, and even Reznov's words echo it too.
And for Germany. They die for Germany. Building by building, room by room, one right at a time.
Like I said earlier, Reznov perfectly represents the feeling of vengeance of the Soviet people. Private Chernov, he symbolizes the wrongs of the war, as the whole vengeance thing is unjust. But Chernov dies later on in the game, which you can see as the death symbolizes of the death of a right voice, a right mind. But back to Reznov, he's not a complete monster. He cares for his people and Chernov, despite Chernov's need to be justice in the war. To me, in my opinion, I think Reznov knows what he's doing is wrong, but he can't help himself. He needs his revenge, but he thinks some of it goes too far. Like with this section, the Soviet soldiers want to set the Germans on fire, as you're given a choice, fast or slow death. And I think in my opinion, Reznov kinda gets uncomfortable with the slow death. As if you let the soldiers or yourself burn the Germans with your Molotovs, he tells Chernov that he should know the idea of mercy killing, and that it's wrong for an animal to suffer. No, Reznov is still in the wrong, as he dehumanizes the Germans, but it seems like he's bothered with a slow death. I know why he's on more of an vengeance drive as explained further in BO1, but we're only looking at the lens of World at War. As for Reznov and the rest of the Red Army, he wants to avenge his fellow countrymen, and he will do that by killing as much Germans as he can, as he says that every sacrifice will be repaid in blood. Like with the American campaign, there is a sense of vengeance, but not to the extent of the Soviets, as the Soviets it's full on display, and with Reznov's statement of the sacrifice bit, it can be said in any modern war for either side of the conflict. But like with Chernov's personality, there are many people like him in the war. It's just that other emotions outweigh the sense of right, and you could do the same too. You cannot shoot the Germans, you're given a choice. For me, I did half and half, as I saw that route to be more the realistic one, as it's more morally grey, and the actions you do, Chernov reflects it on his book, and he gets to write about you, and this is what he has to say.
April 30th, 1945. When he first spoke of Dmitri, Reznov told tales of a hero. Someone we should all aspire to be like. At times, I have seen him show mercy, but at others act with complete brutality. I do not understand him. Perhaps heroes need not question their actions.
There's other speeches that he gives out, but I feel like this one is the more realistic one. Towards the end of the Soviet campaign, the Germans are getting desperate, and we have a hidden detail at the last mission as we see hanging German soldiers. As if you didn't want to fight, they would hang you and set you as an example, if you didn't follow orders. And I know World at War doesn't show this, but some of the hangings were young kids. And on that note, World at War doesn't specifically show any civilian casualties, it only shows military. But they did that because that would be too controversial, as most of the deaths during World War II were civilian deaths, and most civilian deaths were heinous. But still, it really captures the feeling of war with the military deaths. The whole game just captures the feeling of World War II, especially towards the end of the war and the beginning of the war too, for both sides of the Soviet Union and the Americans. As during the end of the Soviet campaign, you fight in the Reichstag, and when everything is done, you plant the Soviet flag, which signifies the end of the war in Europe, and the victory of the Soviets over Germany. But the war in the Pacific still rages on. With the recent Battle of Okinawa, the US didn't want their soldiers to die more, and there was a proposed invasion of mainland Japan, which would have caused significant casualties. So an important decision was made, a decision that will forever change the shape of the world. The atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Later on, Japan surrendered, and World War II was officially over. World War II is still the deadliest conflict in history, and let's keep it that way, as now we have atomic weapons and it can end the world with just a push of a button. I can't think of any other games that capture the same feelings of World War. Only one that comes to mind is Battlefield 1, but that one captures the feelings of World War I. But for these two games, they capture what war feels like, and what is the result of it. No other games capture really well, but these are the two games I have played that resonate with me. Both talk about historical events, and each have a different style of showing it. As for World at War, it's like an interactive documentary, and for Battlefield 1, it's more of a telling of war stories. I think for the interactive documentary for What a War, I think that really helps capture the feeling of war really well, as it blends with real life footage with gameplay in the cutscenes. I think if more games do this, I think people will be more aware how bad the fighting was in World War II and in World War I. And also, I think many people don't realize this, but these soldiers were really young. They were around the age of 18 and 20, and most died on the battlefield. They never got the chance to forge their own life. The soldiers who fought and died during World War II were fighting to keep the world free. They wanted future generations to be not under tyranny. They wanted us to be free, and we can thank them for that. With that note, I'm done talking. I hope you guys have a nice day. This is Mazer Argo signing out.